I will be asking Professor Chomsky a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So I hope you'll prepare your questions. Professor Chomsky, we're here at the United Nations General Assembly. What do you think is the single most important action the UN can take to solve the crisis in the occupied territories between the Palestinians and the Israelis?
Well, we have to bear in mind what all of you know. In the real world, the United Nations can act insofar as the great powers permit it. In this case, that means primarily the United States, its close ally Britain, France. Those are the main actors. And they set pretty strict limits. But within those limits, there are things that the United Nations could do. Recognizing the state of Palestine is a step forward. Already about, I think, over 130 members of the United Nations have taken that step individually. Just recently, there was the first break in Europe. Sweden announced that they would take that step. Just a couple of days ago, the British Parliament voted to recognize Palestine. Bear in mind that the governing Tory party basically boycotted the election at the request of the Israeli government, which wanted the vote ignored. So it's not a policy change, but it's a significant symbolic move. France has indicated that they might move in that direction. I think these would be important steps. Further steps that could be taken, I think, are to go beyond what has already partially been done. So the European Union, in an important move, did produce a directive calling on member states to avoid any dealings with Israeli institutions that have anything to do with the occupation. So in short, don't participate in criminal acts. That's not an extreme position. That can be done. Several major church groups in the United States, Presbyterians, the Church of Christ, have taken similar positions, also directing themselves against multinationals which are involved in any way in the occupied territories. There's a major boycott being undertaken by major investors of the security firms, the international security firms, which operate in the occupied territories and many other places. All of this could be moved forward to a United Nations resolutions. Possibly even this should be at least tried in the Security Council. If there's a U.S. veto, that's important too, brings forward what's actually happening. All of these are steps that can be undertaken with a recognition that the range of action at the United Nations is, of course, circumscribed by great power politics.
What do you think is the single most important action the United States can take, and what about its role over the years? What is its interest here?
Well, one important action that the United States could take is to live up to its own laws. Of course, it would be nice if it lived up to international law, but maybe that's too much to ask. But live up to its own laws. And there are several. And here, incidentally, I have in mind advice to activists also, who I think ought to be organizing and educating in this direction. There are two crucial cases. One of them is what's called the Leahy Law. Patrick Leahy, Senator Leahy, introduced legislation called the Leahy Law, sending weapons to any military units which are involved in consistent human rights violations. There isn't the slightest doubt that the Israeli army is involved in massive human rights violations, which means that all dispatch of U.S. arms to Israel is in violation of U.S. law. I think that's significant. The U.S. should be called upon by its own citizens to, and by others, to adhere to U.S. law, which also happens to conform to international law in this case, as Amnesty International, for example, for years has been calling for an arms embargo against Israel for this reason. These are all steps that can be taken. The second is the tax-exempt status that is given to organizations in the United States which are directly involved in the occupation and in significant attacks on human and civil rights within Israel itself, like the Jewish National Fund. Take a look at its charter with the State of Israel, which commits it to acting for the benefit of people of Jewish race, religion, and origin within Israel. One of the consequences of that is that by a complex array of laws and administrative practices, the fund pretty much administers about 90% of the land of the country, with real consequences for who can live places. They get tax-exempt status also for their activities in the West Bank, which are strictly criminal. I think that's also straight in violation of U.S. law. Now, those are important things, and I think the U.S. should be pressured internationally and domestically to abandon its virtually unique role, unilateral role in blocking a political settlement for the past 40 years, ever since the first veto in January 1976. That should be a major issue in the media, in convocations like this, in the United Nations, in domestic politics, and government politics, and so on.
The role of the media, can you talk about that, and particularly in the United States? And do you think that the opinion in the United States, public opinion, is shifting on this issue?
Well, the role of the media are somewhat shifting from uniform support for virtually everything that Israel does to, and of course, silence about the U.S. role. That's not just in the case of Israel, that's innumerable other cases as well. But it's slowly shifting, but nevertheless, one about, say, Operation Protective Edge, one can read in news reporting in the New York Times, major journal, a criticism of Hamas's assault on Israel during Protective Edge. Hamas's assault on Israel. Not exactly what happened, but that's what people are reading, and that's the way it's depicted. Israel is, over and over, it's pointed out, look, poor Israel is under attack. It has the right of self-defense. Everyone agrees to that. Actually, I agree too. Everyone has a right of self-defense. But that's not the question. The question is, do you have a right of self-defense by force, by violence? The answer is no for anyone, whether it's an individual or a state, unless you have exhausted peaceful means. If you won't even permit peaceful means, which is the case here, then you have no right of self-defense by violence. But try to find a word about that in the media. All you find is self-defense. When President Obama rarely says anything about what's happening, it's usually, if my daughters were being attacked by rockets, I would do anything to stop it. He's referring not to the hundreds of Palestinian children who are being killed and slaughtered, but to the children in the Israeli town of Sderot, which is under attack by Qassam missiles. And remember that Israel knows exactly how to stop those missiles, namely live up to a ceasefire for the first time. And then they would stop, as in the past, even when Israel didn't live up to a ceasefire. That framework, and of course the rest of the framework is the United States is an honest broker trying hard to bring the two recalcitrant sides together, doing its best in this noble endeavor, has nothing to do with the case. The U.S. is, as some of the U.S. negotiators have occasionally acknowledged, Israel's lawyer. If there were serious negotiations going on, they would be led by some neutral party, maybe Brazil, which has some international respect, and they would bring together the two sides. On the one side, Israel and the United States. On the other side, the Palestinians. Those would be possible realistic negotiations. But the chances of anyone in the media, either, I won't even say pointing it out, even thinking about it, is minuscule. The indoctrination is so deep that really elementary facts like these, and they are elementary, are almost incomprehensible. But to get back to the last point you mentioned, it's very important. Opinion in the United States is shifting. Not as fast as in most of the world, not as fast as in Europe. It's not reaching the point where you could get a vote in Congress, anything like the British Parliament a couple of days ago. But it is changing, mostly among younger people, and changing substantially. I'll just illustrate with personal experience. Amy has the same experience. Until pretty recently, when I gave talks on these topics, as I've been doing for 40 years, I literally had to have police protection. Even at my own university, MIT, police would insist on walking me back to my car because of threats they'd picked up. Meetings were broken up and so on. That's all gone. Just a couple of days ago, I had a talk on these topics at MIT. Meeting wasn't broken up, no police protection, maybe 500 or 600 students were there, all enthusiastic, engaged, committed, concerned, wanting to do something about it. That's happening all over the country. All over the country. Palestinian solidarity is one of the biggest issues on campus. Enormous change in the last few years. That's the way things tend to change. It often starts with younger people. Gradually it gets to the rest of the population. Efforts of the kind I mentioned, say trying to get the United States government to live up to its own laws, those could be undertaken on a substantial scale, domestically and with support from international institutions. And that could lead to further changes. I think that for example, the two things that I mentioned would have a considerable appeal to much of the American public. Why should they be funding military units that are carrying out massive human rights violations? Why should they be permitting a tax exemption, meaning we pay for it? That's what a tax exemption means. Why should we be compelled to pay for violations of fundamental human rights in another country and even in occupied territories where it's criminal? I think that can appeal to the American population and can lead to the kinds of changes we've seen in other cases.
Noam, if you were writing a reader's guide to accompany the New York Times in its coverage of Israel and Palestine, what advice would you give?
I would tell them to watch Democracy Now! And that wasn't pre-planned.
And if you're wondering where you can watch it, democracynow.org. Final question before we open it up to each of you. Your thoughts on the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divest, Sanctions movement?
Well, the BDS is a set of tactics, right? These are tactics that you employ when you think they're going to be effective and in ways that you think will be effective. Tactics are not principles. They're not actions that you undertake no matter what because you think they're right. Tactics are undertaken, if you're serious, because you think they're going to help the victims. That's how you adjust your tactics. Not because I think they're right in principle, but because I think they will be beneficial. That ought to be second nature to activists. Also, second nature should be a crucial distinction between proposing and advocating. I can propose now that we should all live in peace and love each other. I just proposed it. It's not a serious proposal. It becomes a serious proposal when it becomes advocacy. It is given, I sketch out a path for getting from here to there. Then it becomes serious. Otherwise, it's empty words. That's crucial and related to this. Well, when you take a look at the BDS movement, which is separate, incidentally, from BDS tactics, let me make that clear. So when the European Union issued its directive, or when that I mentioned, or when, say, the Gates Foundation withdraws investment in security operations that are being carried out not only in the occupied territories but elsewhere, that's very important. But that's not the BDS movement. That's BDS tactics, actually, BD tactics, boycott, divestment tactics. That's important. The BDS movement itself has been an impetus to these developments, and in many ways a positive one, but I think it has failed and should reflect on its so far unwillingness to face what are crucial questions for activists. What's going to help the victims and what's going to harm them? What is a proposal and what is real advocacy? You have to think that through, and it hasn't been sufficiently done. So if you take a look at the principles of the BDS movement, there are three. They vary slightly in wording, but basically three. One is actions should be directed against the occupation. That has been extremely successful in many ways, and it makes sense. It also helps educate the Western populations who are being appealed to participate. It's an opening to discuss, investigate, organize about the participation in the occupation. It's very successful. A second principle is that BDS actions should be continued until Israel allows the refugees to return. That has had no success, and to the extent that it's been tried, it's been negative. It just leads to a backlash. No basis has been laid for it among the population. It is simply interpreted as saying, oh, you want to destroy the state of Israel. We're not going to destroy a state. You cannot undertake actions which you think are principled when in the real world they are going to have a harmful effect on the victims. There's a third category having to do with civil rights within Israel, and there are things that could be done here. One of the ones I mentioned, in fact, the tax-free status for U.S. organizations that are engaged in civil rights and human rights violations. And remember, a tax exemption means I pay for it. That's what a tax exemption is. Well, that's an action that could be undertaken. Others that have been undertaken have had backlashes which are harmful. And I won't run through the record, but these are the kinds of questions that always have to be asked when you're involved in serious activisms if you care about the victims. Not just feeling good, but caring about the victims. That's critically important.
We're going to open up this discussion, and I see on the request list the first up is the State of Palestine.
Thank you very much. And I would like to begin by stating on behalf of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian leadership our gratitude and admiration to Professor Chomsky for his principled position in supporting the just cause of the Palestinian people, and his name is an inspiring name in all of our colleges, universities, among the activists, and even among those who are struggling against the occupation in towns like Bil'in, Na'lin, and so many of them on a daily basis, while the Palestinian people are continuing their struggle to attain their national rights, including their right to self-determination, statehood, freedom, and independence. Of course, also we are very grateful for the Committee on the Exercise on the Inalienable Rights for organizing this event. One of the events, I would say that a very special event, as we commemorate the International Year of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. That was a resolution adopted by the General Assembly that this year to be a special year in trying to give a big push to advance the cause of the Palestinian people. And of course, we would like to thank you very much for moderating this event, which, as judging from the number of people, is a very successful event. And I believe the Palestinian people who just came out of a very bloody aggression that started in the West Bank through East Jerusalem and went for 50 days on the Gaza Strip, do really appreciate the fact that there is this big support as we see it here. And I'm a diplomat. I know that we have an immense support among the community of nations. One can see it through the voting on resolutions, not only on the historic one on November 29, 2012, in which in this chamber the great majority of nations recognized the state of Palestine and changed the status to an observer state. So we are grateful for all these things, and we are very grateful for that comprehensive presentation by Professor Chomsky. I just want to concentrate in two areas. I listened very closely to everything that you have said, and I agree with what you've said in connection with the policy of the United States of America vis-à-vis the Palestinian people and their cause. And I totally agree with you with regard to the policies and practices of the occupying authority and the Israeli government vis-à-vis the Palestinian people, particularly in the occupied territory. But what I just want to add, which I am sure you know it, but I need just to make sure that it comes out loud and clear, that in this equation, it is not only the Israelis who are dictating policies and dictating the future of the Palestinian people, nor the Americans as well. It is the Palestinian people who are a very important element of this configuration. It appears that our situation is extremely difficult, because it is, but our determination is so strong that in all of the battles that we were forced to go through, including the ones in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and in the Gaza Strip, not a single person from the Palestinians raised the white flag. So we, the Palestinian people, are determined to continue the struggle in spite of the fact that it is so difficult, in order to attain our freedom and to learn from everyone, including from the remarkable experience in South Africa. Although I agree with you, we have so many differences in terms of the two experiences, although we have many in common. But yet, our people are dead determined that we do not want to stay in Bantustans, in apartheid style, in occupation, under occupation. We are determined to accomplish the objective of ending the occupation and the independence of our state and our freedom. We are doing our share as a key player in this configuration, and we are very grateful for the international support, whether we see it here at the United Nations through the position of member states, or whether we see it through activities of civil societies, the BDS, and all those who have, contributed to resolving causes such as in Vietnam and in other places. We are, grateful that they are, on our side, and they're doing what they are doing, and they're trying to improve their work so that they can help us to accomplish this objective. So on this point, I just wanted to say that we are in the forefront. We are not a footnote. We are a key player in spite of the fact that the odds are so huge against us. The odds were so huge against the people in South Africa, but the people of South Africa came out victorious. The odds were so huge against the people in Vietnam, but the Vietnamese people came victorious, and we are no exception to the rule, and we are determined to join those who have succeeded in putting an end to their miseries and acquiring their independence and freedom. That's the first thing. The second thing, I agree with you on the issue of the strategy of Israel and those who support them is to try to divide us so that the objective of a two-state solution not to be, accomplished. In this connection, I just want, and I'm sure that you know that, but I want to highlight it and underscore it, that in our struggle, we've accomplished two major historic accomplishments since 1948. The first historic accomplishment, that we succeeded in having one party to speak on behalf of the Palestinians. That is the Palestine Liberation Organization, which is composed of many political groups among the Palestinians. So it took us tens of years to be able, to have a political representation to speak on behalf of all of the Palestinian people in the occupied territory and outside. And by the time we reached the summit of the Arab Summit in Morocco in 1974, to acknowledge that, yes, the Palestine Liberation Organization is the representative of the Palestinian people, and Chairman Arafat came to this very chamber to speak on behalf of the Palestinian people, and we came back to the UN after we left it in 1948. That historic accomplishment is huge. And of course, with time, there were things that happened, including the examples that you mentioned in Gaza, regardless of the basis of them, that threatened the representation of the Palestinian people. And I am sure that you know that the Israeli side played an immense role, particularly after the first Intifada in '87, to try to put a wedge on this issue of the representation of the Palestinian people. The second historic accomplishment, the fact that we were able to put Palestine in the geopolitical map, because after 1948, our homeland was fragmented into three pieces, as we all know. One piece became Israel, the other one was the West Bank, became part of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and the Gaza Strip was put under the Egyptian administration. In 1988, the struggle of the Palestinian people succeeded in unifying the different parts of our homeland. So when we refer to the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem in the singular, versus the occupied Palestinian territories, including East Jerusalem in the plural, it is an intended characterization to reflect the evolution and the progress in our movement, that we were able to have one political unit that constitute the total land of the state of Palestine, to include the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. Of course, the tragic split that took place for almost 8 years between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank is a huge setback for our national movement, and it was a huge also gain for the Israeli side to destroy that evolution and to take us back to the situation that existed, or similar to the situation that existed in 1948. Therefore, our agreement in April of this year to put an end to the split and to establish a national consensus government is a historic step in order to rectify the damage to these historical accomplishments within our movement in terms of the representation in one hand, the PLO, and also the unity of the different parts of our homeland in one geopolitical unit, that is the land of the State of Palestine. And I agree with you that the Israeli attack on us, from the moment that we declared the agreement on putting an end to the split officially, but of course the ramification of the split and the wounds that it created, it is going to take us some time of a genuine effort to learn from that experience, that no matter how we disagree with each other, but we should not play with these two historic accomplishments, the unity of the land and also the representation of our people. And I agree with you that this war started immediately in the West Bank to humiliate President Abbas and the Palestinian leadership, because they were trotting from Hebron through Jerusalem, through Ramallah, to Nablus, to Jenin, to try to show the Palestinian people that this national consensus government means nothing, and it cannot protect a single Palestinian, nor can prevent us from putting in prison anyone that we wish, including those who have been released through an agreement of exchange of prisoners. Then it went to Gaza to prove to everyone, including to our brothers in Hamas, that maintain the split, everything will be fine and dandy. But if you want to have unity, you have to pay a huge price for it, so that we want the people in Gaza to be against you in order to tell you that when you went in the direction of unity, Gaza has been destroyed to no level, even much more than the two wars before that. So therefore, all these things were tried, including from this chamber, Prime Minister Netanyahu, after he failed in convincing, as you said, leaders of the world to be against the national consensus government. And after he waged this war in order to push us back to division, he came and he failed in these two attempts. He tried from this chamber to convince the leaders of the world, and by the way, there are no Boy Scouts in this business, in this chamber. All of them are very astute diplomats, and they know what they're doing and what is going on. When he tried to convince them for the third time in an exercise of futility that Hamas is Daesh, meaning that if you are building, or ISIS, if you are building an international consensus against ISIS, you should include Hamas in it, thinking that world leaders who did not agreed with him in attacking the national consensus government and did not agree with him on this war that he waged against our people, including the Gaza Strip, that they will agree with him to attack Hamas as being similar, to ISIS. And they did not agree with him on that event. So what I want to just conclude from that these two remarkable things for us to maintain the unity of our land and to regain the unity of our political representation, which is the PLO, and its government, which is the national consensus government, in which all political groups, including our brothers from Hamas, agreed to its formation, and we have to succeed in the challenges before us in undertaking the monumental task of rebuilding Gaza, so that we can continue on the path of the struggle to put an end to this occupation, to attain our independence, and to attain our freedom and dignity. Again, I want to thank you very much for being with us. You are, a superstar in this chamber, and that is the pulse of the people, the pulse of justice, and we are delighted that you shared these thoughts with us this afternoon. Thank you.
I would just like to briefly endorse those extremely important points and to register my own feeling of deep emotion and that I always feel when you see the inspiring efforts of people struggling for their rights under shocking conditions and finally even winning them. And I think that will be true for the Palestinians too.
The representative of Guyana.
I think it's me, but I'm not a representative. I'm so sorry. I'm just sitting in the
Rula
display.
Jibril.
My question is, if you were the president of the Palestinian Authority, we asked what would you do if, what the United States should do or Israel, but if you were the representative actually, what would you do? Would you absolve the authority? What steps would you take to solve the conflict? Thank you.
If I was a representative of the Palestinian Authority, well, I think the most important things are what the ambassador just described. Overcoming the split between Gaza and the West Bank is a step of critical significance, and maintaining the unity government in the face of the attacks that are being launched against it from many sides is going to be a hard battle and one of critical significance. Another is maintaining the resistance within Palestine against the steps that are being taken to gradually dismantle and cantonize and divide it. Those are all require courage and dedication and commitment of a kind that is familiar to many of you here who represent countries that have undergone national liberation struggles. And this is another one of the last. Remember that Palestine is the one of two remaining colonies that have not been decolonized. The other is Western Sahara. And these struggles continue, merit our support, and have to be led, as was just said, by the people of the countries themselves. Another is to reach out to international opinion and to try to help educate, stimulate organization, stimulate policies which will contribute to these just ends. Those are the constant goals of national liberation struggles. They apply in different ways in different circumstances, but there's a commonality that virtually underlies the existence of the United Nations. After all, the United Nations, in its form, at least since the 1960s, is the result of decolonization, of national liberation struggles against the colonial imperial powers, many of which have succeeded, which is why you're here. Others are still in process and have to be brought into it. And the Palestinian Authority should be, and is, in fact, in the lead in conducting these efforts.
The representative of South Africa.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. And we want to express our sincere gratitude to Professor Chomsky for his understanding of the situation in the Middle East in particular, but his understanding of the struggle for liberation all over the world in general. Now, just two questions. One of the two options that you spoke about, one, the reality is that the facts are being changed on the ground on a daily basis, even now as we speak. And in no time, I guess, even in our lifetime, though the term lifetime is relative, we may see a situation where it may become very difficult to talk about a two-state solution. Because of the reality itself, we may not have a piece of land that you can say the other state will exist on the basis of this piece of land. Now, the question that I have is similar to what Lenin raised some decades ago and say, what should the progressive forces do? the progressive forces now in the prosecution of the struggle of the Palestinian people. And the second one is linked to the recent announcements, one made in Sweden about the recognition of the state of Palestine, and a recent vote in the British Parliament. Do you foresee a possibility that such announcements will be increasing in the next few years, and that may have the potential to change the balance of forces, including in the Security Council? We all know that of the P5, at least China and Russia are very clear about where they stand on the matter, and the others as well. We know their position. So I'm wondering whether you think you will see an increase, and what will that mean for the balance of forces in the UN? Thank you very much.
Well, with regard to the first question, I think the effort to achieve a two-state settlement is by no means finished. The United States is in a position, if there is sufficient pressure from inside and outside, to essentially terminate the Israeli occupation. The United States there are many examples like this. No two cases are identical, of course, but take, say, South Africa. Took a long time before first international opinion and finally the United States was willing to accept the end of apartheid. After all, it was 1988 when President Reagan's administration declared the African National Congress to be one of the one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. That was 1988, just a couple of years before the end of apartheid. By then, President Reagan actually had to try to overcome congressional vetoes to continue his support for South Africa. Finally, it happened. In the case of East Timor, which Amy brought up earlier, the Indonesian generals insisted that they would never leave. This was their territory. One government in the world, the government of Australia, under Foreign Minister Gareth Evans, recognized East Timor as a province of Indonesia. It looked as if, he looked at the balance of forces, it looked as if this was over. Enough pressure was put on President Clinton internationally and domestically so that he simply informed the Indonesian military that the game was over. They pulled out. East Timor, in a difficult and harsh struggle, finally ended up with independence. And there are other cases. I don't think this struggle is by any means over. Not at all. If it is, I think, but if a time comes when it is over, I don't think we're anywhere near that. The United States and Israel ought to be so isolated internationally that they will suffer from having carried out this crime. But I don't think we're at that stage. The progressive forces in the world can do many things to carry forward the struggle for a two-state settlement and achieve that. And incidentally, in my view, that is not a good settlement. It may be the best short-term one, but it's by no means the end of the road. My expectation would be, my hope, that if the cycle of violence can be reduced, what we will see is what in fact has happened in earlier periods when there has been a reduction in hostilities and violence. Namely, natural connections begin to develop across the boundary. It's a very artificial boundary. Anyone who knows anything about the former Palestine knows that you just can't draw a sensible line through it. So I assume that, as in the past, there'll be beginnings of cultural, commercial, other relations leading to the kind of integration that would be healthy for both sides, in my opinion, but will have to come from their own internal dynamics and can. And that's not the end of the road either. There is no reason for us to accept to worship the imperial imposed boundaries. As in most of the world, the boundaries there are imposed by the imperial powers, Britain and France primarily in this case. The boundary between Israel and Lebanon, for example, is totally artificial. Actually, 60 years ago when I was hiking in northern Israel, I walked across it by accident, and somebody had to call me and tell me to come back. I'm in another country. It just means nothing. It just breaks a natural region in part. I think those borders can erode. It's actually beginning to happen in many parts of the world. It's in that context, I think, that there might be a meaningful solution eventually to the very pressing and significant refugee problem. There's a long way to go, and I think there are many steps that can be taken. I don't think we're anywhere near saying, look, it's over, we have to give up. What was the second question? I forgot already. There was a second.
The second part of that question?
The second part of this question was in relation to the recent announcement, one by the new government of Sweden on the recognition of the state of Palestine, and the recent vote in Britain on the recognition as well, and the impact it's likely going to have, and the possibility of the balance of forces being tilted in favor of the Palestinian struggle.
I think these are very important steps. The Swedish moves breaks the unanimity of the West in refusing to join the world on this issue. Remember, most of the world has already gone this way. My recollection is over 130 countries have recognized the state of Palestine. The Swedish move kind of breaks a logjam for the West. The British parliamentary vote is not a government decision. As I think I said, the Conservative Party essentially followed Israel's request that it ignore the vote. So it's a minority vote, but significant. It reflects the shift of attitudes and understanding, and every one of those shifts stimulates further moves. And here's a message to activists: can be used to stimulate further moves. I think this can spread. And if it spreads sufficiently, it will contribute to rehabilitating, reconstructing the possibility of a viable two-state settlement, in my view, as a step towards other things that will be much preferable.
Mr. Lofty, mic number 2271.
Hi, Dr. Chomsky and Amy. Thank you very much for this excellent proceedings here today. United States has always been a problem, I think, in this issue, and I believe if we can solve it from here, the people in the region may solve it among themselves. I think we are the main issue. As you said, the job is with the activists, and I was wondering, what's your thoughts about what is our hang-up with unconditional support of Israel over the years? Psychologically, socially, in what reason is it that over the years, and I've been educated through your books, through Democracy Now!, the fact that we are always on the wrong side of the history on this issue? What is it that makes us be like that? Have you thought about that? And this could be a subject of your next book. Why do we unconditionally support it?
I couldn't hear it, could you?
Make that last point in a sentence.
Why do we unconditionally support Israel in most of the cases? We have never been, we always weed out everything, and we always end up being on the wrong side of the history. What is it psychologically or socially that we unconditionally support Israel?
Meaning the United States.
Yes, United States.
Yeah. Why does the United States support Israel? Well, there's a history, and a very interesting one. It actually goes back a long time. One thing to remember is that Christian Zionism is a very powerful force, which goes back long before Jewish Zionism. In England, particularly, Christian Zionism was a powerful force among British elites. It's part of the motivation for the Balfour Declaration and for Britain's support for Jewish colonization of Israel. Remember, the Bible said, and that's a big part of British elite culture. Same in the United States. Woodrow Wilson was a devout Christian who read the Bible every day. So did Harry Truman. In the Roosevelt administration, one of the leading officials, Harold Ickes, once described the return of the Jews to Palestine as the greatest event in history. It's realizing the lesson of the Bible. These are deeply religious countries in which the biblical commands, so-called, are taken quite literally. Also, this is just part of colonization. This is the last phase of European colonization. And notice that the countries that are most strongly in support of Israel are not just the United States. It's the United States, Australia, and Canada, the offshoots of England, Anglosphere sometimes called, unusual forms of imperialism. These are settler colonial societies, societies in which not like India, not like the British in India, say, societies, South Africa was a little like this, or Algeria under the French, settler colonial societies in which the settlers came in, essentially eliminated the native population, also driven by religious principles, very religious groups driven by Christian Zionism. Those are major cultural factors. There are also significant geostrategic factors. You go back to 1948, there was actually a split between the State Department and the Pentagon in the United States over how to react to the new state of Israel. The State Department was not committed strongly to Israeli conquests, the establishment of the state, and was concerned about the refugees. It wanted an implementation of the refugee problem. The Pentagon, on the other hand, was very impressed with Israel's military potential. The Israeli military successes, if you look back at the internal record and declassified, the Joint Chiefs of Staff described Israel as the second largest military force in the region after Turkey and a potential base for U.S. power in the region. That continued. Can't run through the whole record, but in 1958, when there was a serious crisis in the region, Israel was the only state that strongly cooperated with Britain and the United States, and it won plenty of support from the governments and the military for that reason. 1967 is when the current relations with Israel were pretty much established. Israel performed a major service to the United States by destroying a secular Arab nationalism, a major enemy of the United States, and supporting radical Islam, which the U.S. supported. And it continues right until the present. Right now, we saw an example of that just during the latest Gaza attack. You recall that at one point, Israel began to run out of munitions during the assault, despite the fact that it's armed to the teeth. The United States provided Israel with additional munitions through the Pentagon. And notice where they were taken from. These were U.S. munitions pre-positioned in Israel for eventual use by U.S. forces. One of many signs of how Israel is regarded as essentially a military offshoot of the United States. Very close intelligence relations that go way back, many other connections. And the media tend to take up, to support the policy of the government with very few, kind of little questioning around the edges, but basically accept the policy. So, for example, take another issue. Take the U.S. invasion of Iraq. You cannot find the phrase U.S. invasion of Iraq in the U.S. media. There was obviously an invasion, a blatant act of aggression, a textbook case of that's Nuremberg trials called the supreme international crime. Cannot be mentioned. President Obama is praised as an opponent of the invasion What did he say? He said it's a mistake. It's a strategic blunder. We're not going to get away with it. That's the kind of opposition that you heard from the German general staff during Hitler's invasion of Russia. It's a blunder. Shouldn't do it. Should knock off England first. That's regarded as opposition. Same in Vietnam. There's now a commemoration underway, big commemoration of U.S. sacrifices in Vietnam. Try to find the phrase U.S. invasion of South Vietnam there or anywhere in the past year since 1961 when it took place. Non-existent. Maybe on Democracy Now, what I write, but way out at the fringe. And this is not unique to the United States. Take, say, Britain. Right now there's interesting debates in the British literary journals, like the Times Literary Supplement, as to whether Britain should finally begin to recognize the genocidal, the word that's used, genocidal character of British colonization hundreds of years ago. Should Britain begin to face it? You can ask that question in many places. The tendency of the intellectual community to go along like a herd in support of state power, private power, is just overwhelming. Intellectuals like to think of themselves as dissident, critical, courageous, standing up against power. Absolutely untrue. You look at the historical record, that's a small fringe, and they're usually punished. The mainstream tends to be what was once called a herd of independent minds, marching in support of state power. Nothing new here. Unfortunate. You have to fight against it, not new.
We're just going to take two more questions. The first is from the representative of Cuba. Next up is mic number 2192, Mr. Callett. And who is he?
My question is, who should morally be in charge?
My name is Caleb Maupin. I'm a correspondent with Press TV News. And in the last couple days, there have been reports in the U.S. media quoting figures from the Mujahideen Khalq, which is a terrorist organization, alleging that Iran is developing nuclear weapons. And it has been leaked that the Israeli government has cooperated with Mujahideen Khalq to assassinate Iranian nuclear scientists. And my question is that a violation of international law? And why is it that Israel is cooperating with what was at one point universally recognized as a violent terrorist organization?
Violation of international, we can debate this or that fact that's not yet accepted and agreed, but there are gross violations of international law which are proclaimed openly and publicly and presented with self-praise. So, for example, suppose that when President Obama, or any Western, any American diplomat or journalist, says that with regard to Iran, all options are open, as is said constantly. What does that mean? All options are open means force is open, means nuclear attack is open. Those of you who may recall an obscure document called the UN Charter might remember Article 2, which bans the threat or use of force in international affairs. The threat or use of force. They're all violating international law openly and proudly. And the same is true when they support criminal organizations. The U.S. and Israel don't deny, they kind of nod their heads about, say, the assassination of Iranian scientists or the cyber attacks on Iran, which are openly acknowledged and praised. All violations of international law. What about Iranian nuclear weapons? Well, there are ways to approach the question of nuclear weapons. In fact, some of you may recall who have a long memory, back as far as 2010, when an agreement was reached between Turkey, Brazil, and Iran to settle the issue of Iranian nuclear developments. The agreement was that Iran would transfer to Turkey its low enriched uranium, so there'd be no issue of developing nuclear weapons, and in return the Western powers would provide Iran with the isotopes it needs for its medical research. As soon as that agreement was reached, it was bitterly denounced by the U.S. government, by President Obama, by Congress, by the media. How dare they do this? The government of Brazil was kind of irritated, and its foreign minister released a letter from President Obama to President Lula of Brazil proposing exactly this. Presumably he proposed it because he thought that Iran would never agree. Well, Iran did agree, so then came the attack, then come all kind of pretexts. That's 2010. Let's go on to 2012, okay? A little more recent, maybe easier to remember. In December 2012, there was supposed to be a conference in Helsinki, organized under UN auspices, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, organized a conference in Helsinki to take steps towards establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. Actually, a zone free of weapons of mass destruction, but crucially, nuclear weapons. That was December 2012, international conference. Everyone waited to see. Israel said they would not attend. Next question, what will Iran say? Iran said they would attend with no conditions. A couple of days later, the United States canceled the conference. Pretexts, this is that reason, but it didn't take place. Virtually no mention of this in the U.S. media. Do a study. It tells you something about the media. Hardly a mention. Well, that's another opportunity. Lots of ways of dealing with the nuclear weapons problem, and of course recall that there is one state in the region which is armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons, hundreds of nuclear weapons, the state of Israel, with U.S. support. So there are things that can be done about the nuclear weapons issue if anyone's serious about it. But as far as your point about violating international law is concerned, all the time, openly and proudly.
We'll end with Ms. Nushen Daria Framke of the Israel-Palestine Mission Network of the Presbyterian Church, USA.
Thank you.
Number 2324.
Thank you. I want to thank you for mentioning the Presbyterian Church's vote this summer for the B and the D tactic, as you put it. We voted to divest from the 3 American companies who profit from the occupation. So thanks for mentioning that. And but my question actually is unrelated. How would you respond to the charge that anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism?
Actually, the locus classicus, the best formulation of this, was by an ambassador to the United Nations, Abba Eban, Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, in an article that he wrote about 45 years ago, which I urge you to read, which appeared in an American Jewish journal, Congress Weekly, a major journal of the more liberal wing of the American Jewish community. He wrote an interesting article in which he was then UN ambassador from the State of Israel. He advised the American Jewish community that they had 2 tasks to perform. One task was to show that criticism of the policy, what he called anti-Zionism, that means actually criticisms of the policy of the State of Israel, were anti-Semitism. That's the first task. Second task, if the criticism was made by Jews, Their task was to show that its neurotic self-hatred needs psychiatric treatment. And he gave two examples of the latter category. One was I.F. Stone, the other was me. So we have to be treated for our psychiatric disorders, and non-Jews have to be condemned for anti-Semitism if they're critical of the state of Israel. It's understandable why Israeli propaganda would take this position. I don't particularly blame Abba Eban for doing what ambassadors are sometimes supposed to do, but we ought to understand it. There is no sensible charge. No sensible charge. There's nothing to respond to. It's not a form of anti-Semitism. It's simply criticism of the criminal actions of a state. Period.
Well, when you have the great muckraking journalist I.F. Stone and the leading political dissident in the United States today, Noam Chomsky, criticizing you, you know you have to reconsider your position. It has been wonderful hearing from Professor Noam Chomsky today as you gathered a crowd of hundreds of people to hear you. Thank you so much for being with us. And tune in to democracynow.org, where you can see this whole session as well as other interviews with Professor Chomsky. Thanks so much.